be another Sino-Japanese war, I would suggest that everybody loses, and not only Japan and China, but everybody in the neighborhood as well. I started by saying that history does matter because people use it all the time, and our lack of better understanding of history inhibits us from being able to deal rationally when historical arguments are used. For example, I give you just an example. People quote, why don't the Japanese behave like the Germans after the Second World War? Well, clearly, this is a historical example in one sense. But of course, Japanese are not Germans. And the war in Germany, fought by the Nazi party of Hitler, is not the kind of war that the Japanese fought against China. In the case of the results of the war, the Nazi party was totally eliminated, and the German people responded completely against the Nazi party's past to respond to the consequences of the war. In Japan's case, it was not a Nazi party, it was not one party, it was a total leadership in the name of the emperor. And all the people fought for their emperor and for their nation. In those terms, the Japanese did not feel about the war the way the German people felt about the Nazi leaders who led them to war. There's no comparison. So to use the analogy, to me, that's a very inaccurate analogy. And to expect the Japanese to behave like the Germans over the apologies seemed to me unhistorical. It just doesn't bear close examination. But it's one example. Another example, of course, the ones that have been recently raised, comparing World War I, comparing even the Chinese themselves compare, they say Jiawu, 120 years, another Jiawu, another Sino-Japanese war. The Chinese use that comparison, and the Abe has used the World War I as another example, 100 years after World War I. So all these are nice symbolic phrases in rhetoric, rhetorically very interesting, but not to be taken seriously, in my view, because the analogies are simply don't fit. But I don't want to go into the details of that, but let me conclude by talking of three other comments one can make. One is that what prevented war after the Second World War was a Cold War. I don't think we should forget that, because there could have been many reasons why there could have been a hot war since 1945. But the Cold War ensured that there wasn't. One of the reasons why was that people have attributed it to a central balance of two forces on both sides that, had they acted, would have been mutual destruction, total destruction. And that was the reason why nobody acted. So there were only proxy wars, little proxy wars, which were fought on the edges, but the major protagonists stayed out of the war. Today we don't have that, but we have had the Cold War experience. Is it possible to restore some kind of central balance in which it becomes so obvious to everybody involved that war would be so destructive that nobody would even try, and that Japan and China would be powerful enough to be in the position where it is so clear to the leaders, no matter what the people felt or said in the blogs, the leaders would tell their people, this is absolute destruction, suicide for the country, for all of you, if we went that far. So, I mean, is it possible? The Cold War experience, I think, has something to teach us, and I think we should pay attention. The third-party approach, I think we shouldn't count too much on a third party being able to deter a war between China and Japan. I think the United States means well, and the United States will do its best to prevent it. But of course, we can't depend on it. So I wouldn't put my money all on the United States being able to tell the Chinese and Japanese not to fight. If the Chinese and Japanese do not fight, it will be because their leaders recognize that it is not in their interest to fight. I would argue that leaders are meant to calculate the long-term interests of their country and not to simply listen to popular nationalist voices, no matter how loud, and no matter how passionate, and would stand up to what people say they think is good for them by being able to say firmly and clearly that it is not good for the country or for their people. And as leaders, they must stand up to all those threat pressures. And I would say that the leaders of China and Japan, as far as I understand them, are perfectly capable of doing that if they want to. And finally, just to end on a historical note, I did say at the beginning that history is always there. Whether there's too much history or too little history, one can argue. Probably too much if you keep on using history as a weapon to beat other people with. But in my view as a historian, too little history because too many people don't know enough history to know how to interpret when other people use history for their private, personal, selfish, or nihilistic reasons. And my last call is that maybe some efforts would be great to be made to greatly increase the knowledge of history, hopefully that it might make a difference to the leaders when they listen to their people. Thank you very much.
The panel will now take questions for 30 minutes from the audience, and we have microphones, 3 places in the room. When you come up to the microphone, please start by identifying which college or other institution you're from, and then your name, and then please restrict yourself to 1 question. We have a lot of people in the audience, so 2, 3 questions at a time, or follow-up questions are probably not appropriate for the short period of time we have. Go ahead, sir.
Okay, good evening, distinguished guests. So I'm previously from Cinnamon College.
Over there.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So my question will be directed towards Professor Wang. I've read that a British scholar have said that the British gunboats have made less impact to China versus the second Sino-Chinese War, the Sino-Japanese War. So in your opinion, how does the second Sino-Japanese War shape contemporary post-independent Chinese identity?
Could you repeat your question again?
So how does the second Sino-Japanese War shape contemporary Chinese identity?
Second war meaning the one that started in 1937?
Yes.
Okay.
It's a very big question, and one can answer that in so many different ways. But probably the most important issue that arose from the war with Japan was that it created true nationalism among the Chinese. I say that because my understanding of history is that the Chinese have never been nationalistic. They have no concept of nation. They had a concept of their civilization. They thought they were very superior. They were culturally superior to everybody else. But that was not nationalism. And if they were unhappy with foreigners, they did suffer from xenophobia. Mm-hmm. And that's very common in all people. Strangers are always suspicious, and everybody can suffer from some xenophobia sometime or other. But they never had nationalism. If you look at all the wars they fought with Britain, with France, with Japan in the first case, and all down to the 20th century, there's no sign of Chinese nationalism. The Chinese fought the British in the Opium War with no sense of nationalism. A sign of patriotism, yes. They loved their own territory. They didn't like foreigners attacking them. Some of them may have even fought for the emperor, for all I know. But it was never for the nation. There's no concept. When Sun Yat-sen talked about the Chinese nation, he had actually discovered it for the Chinese people. And he was the first to complain that the Chinese people were not nationalistic at all. He was extremely disappointed when he went round and found how unnationalistic the Chinese were. And the only way he could arouse the Chinese was to say, destroy the Manchus. But it was not nationalism. It was just that these guys conquered us, killed thousands and millions of us, and try to rule over